Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into a history that spans millennia, the story of Iran, known for much of its past as Persia.
hmm
We've been sifting through some fascinating source material, particularly a key document covering, roughly 3,000 years of this incredibly rich and complex narrative.
Yeah, it's a huge sweep of time, and our mission in this deep dive is really to give you a shortcut.
A shortcut through 3,000 years. Sounds good.
Exactly. To navigate that vast time scale, identifying the pivotal moments, the major empires that rose and fell, and those enduring threads that have woven together the identity of Iran.
Right.
We want to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, the surprising facts, the key insights, so you can feel well-informed without having to, wade through everything yourself.
It's the ultimate deep dive into history, isn't it? And Iran is such a compelling place to start because it truly is a cradle of civilization.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not just where history happened, it's where empires were built, like right on top of previous layers, leaving behind traces that we're still uncovering today, often through archaeology.
Exactly. And that reliance on archaeology actually points to one of the core challenges in studying this history, something our source notes.
It is.
Well, just that so many crucial documents, records, entire libraries even, have been lost or destroyed over the millennia.
Okay.
So we're often left piecing together the narrative from, tantalizing fragments.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this history then. Starting right at the beginning, the ancient foundations before the major transformation brought by the arrival of Islam.
Sounds good.
When we talk about the very first civilizations in this region, where does this source take us?
It takes us straight to southwestern Iran. The Elamite kingdom is highlighted as, well, one of the first ancient civilizations to emerge there.
Making Iran one of the original cradles of civilization, alongside places like Mesopotamia.
Precisely.
And what time frame are we looking at for the Elamites? We're talking really early.
We are. The source mentions the first appearance of Elam as a distinct civilization around 3000 BC.
Wow.
Yeah, and the kingdom and civilization really started developing properly around 2500 BC, partly influenced, it seems, by the arrival of Eastern Sumerians in the area.
2500 BC. That is seriously ancient history. Were there specific centers of this early Elamite power? Cities?
Yes, definitely. They had three main capitals mentioned, Anshan, Susa, and Hamadi. Susa in particular really stands out.
Susa. Now that's a name that resonates through later history too, isn't it?
Absolutely. It keeps coming up. The source describes it as often reconstructed as the first city of the Elamites, and truly one of the most ancient historical cities still known today.
Incredible.
Even the Sumerians called it Shish, and apparently found the area great for farming because of the monsoon climate.
So how do we know about this early civilization, given what you said about lost records? Archaeology must be key.
It is absolutely vital. The source points to something like over 80 years of archaeological excavations that have been just crucial in restoring our understanding of Elamite identity.
What kind of things are we finding?
Well, finds from around 2500 BC in Susa give us concrete evidence of their civilization's development. Things like cuneiform writing, distinct pottery styles, sculpture.
So tangible proof.
Right, and archaeology gives us insights into their society and capabilities, too.
Like what? What could they do?
Well, the source highlights their knowledge in areas like astronomy and metallurgy. It points to evidence of pretty sophisticated engineering bridges, irrigation systems, earthworks, even domes.
Wow. Okay. So not just basic settlement.
Not at all. Their art, architecture, writing systems, they weren't just functional. The source suggests they reflected a distinct collective mind. Concepts like harmony and symbolism. You can even see it in things like ziggurats.
Ziggurats, right?
Or even get glimpses into their daily life through things like, believe it or not, taxation records and account formula discovered archaeologically.
Amazing. So far more than just a name from the distant past, they were a highly organized, sophisticated society.
Definitely seems that way.
Okay, moving forward from the Elamites, the next massive chapter has to be the Achaemenid Empire.
Yes, this is often known as the First Persian Empire, established by Cyrus II the Great around 550 BC.
And this was an empire that really changed the scale of things in the region, didn't it?
Fundamentally, it just operated on a different level.
And it reached its peak under Darius the Great. How big are we talking? How extensive was it?
Under Darius, it was colossal. I mean, truly vast. Our source describes it encompassing huge areas from Anatolia and Libya in the west.
Wow.
All the way through Mesopotamia, Persia itself, Bactria, Sogdiana, large parts of Western and Central Asia. This wasn't just big, it was arguably the largest empire the world had ever seen up to that point.
Okay, ruling something that vast must have required a really innovative structure. How on earth did they do it?
That's the key question, isn't it? The source highlights a structure that was, well, both monarchical and federal.
Okay, how did that work?
At the top, you had the monarch, holding absolute supreme power, famously titled the King of Kings,
King of Kings, right?
which reflected that they ruled over many different peoples and kingdoms. The source also notes that the core population were Aryans, which was part of their identity.
Were there any checks on the King of Kings' power? Or was it totally absolute?
The source mentions an advisory assembly of nobles and a smaller assembly for mediation. But yeah, ultimately, the king's authority was absolute. The genius was arguably in the federal division.
How was that set up?
The empire was split into about 20 provinces, or satrapies, under Darius.
Satrapies, okay.
And each satrap was appointed directly by the king. They were like miniature rulers responsible for law, order, taxes, managing the population, raising troops in their specific region.
That makes sense. Decentralized to a degree.
Exactly. And it's interesting, the source notes that satraps in the western homelands were often non-Iranian, which shows a degree of, maybe, administrative flexibility.
Right. Beyond the structure, what were some of their major achievements in, actually binding this massive empire together?
They truly mastered long-distance administration. That was key. The source points to the development of extensive road networks. Think the Royal Road.
Royal Road, yeah, famous.
And a highly efficient postal service. These were absolutely critical for communication control across such a massive territory.
Couldn't do it without them.
Pretty much. They also put up statues of their kings across the realm. And importantly, they developed their own administrative tools, including inventing an alphabet for the Persian languages.
The whole new alphabet.
Yeah, based on Elamite cuneiform, apparently, and modifying Phoenician letters. It seems they were adapting things to suit their own languages.
That leads to language, then. Was it complex?
It seems so. There's an interesting point in the source about language under Darius. It mentions Aramaic being eliminated in favor of Elamite, right after discussing the development of this new script for Persian.
Seems contradictory.
Well, maybe not contradictory, but complex. It suggests a situation where multiple languages were being used administratively, and there was this move away from the very widespread Aramaic towards languages closer to the empire's core, like Elamite and Old Persian, using that new script.
Okay, so adaptation and invention were really key, but even the mighty Achaemenid Empire eventually fell. What brought it down? Such a huge structure.
Yeah, it's always a question, isn't it? The source indicates a pretty swift decline after Darius the Great's death. His successors, Xerxes and Artaxerxes I, just couldn't maintain the same grip.
So internal weakening.
Partly. But also pressure from multiple sides. Revolts erupted in places like Egypt and Babylon. Tribes like the Parthians and Scythians started raiding from the east, and nations in the west rebelled too.
So internal weakening combined with external pressure, a classic recipe.
Exactly. This cumulative resistance, this strain on the whole system, ultimately led to its fall to Alexander the Great by 333 BC. The source also points to internal factors playing a role. Things like religious disagreements and the increasing power of local dynasties in far-flung provinces. It specifically mentions the Sasanian dynasty starting to gain prominence in Fars province way back then.
Foreshadowing. Which neatly brings us to the next era. After Alexander's conquest and the subsequent Hellenistic Seleucid period, the Parthians emerge. They're significant imperial successors, right?
Yes, the Parthian or Arsacid Empire. They arose in the 3rd century BCE, founded by a tribe called the Parni from northeastern Iran. This was during the time the Seleucids, Alexander's successors, controlled the region.
And how did they get started?
Apparently, the source calls him a simple chief named Mithridates, rebelled against the Seleucid king Seleucus and established the kingdom around 247 BCE.
And this kingdom grew into a major power.
Oh, it certainly did. It expanded to become one of the largest empires of its time, reaching the Mediterranean under Mithridates I, even briefly extending beyond it at points.
Their geographical position must have been crucial. They were right in the middle of things.
Absolutely pivotal. Parthia controlled a central chunk of the Silk Road.
The Silk Road.
Yeah, sitting right between the Greco-Roman world to the west and Han China to the east. This position made them key players in trade and cultural exchange, but it also brought them into frequent conflict, particularly with Rome.
Rome's great eastern rival for centuries.
Exactly. And after centuries of that warfare, we see Rome beginning to sort of withdraw from the region in the 3rd century CE. By then, Parthia was already facing its own decline anyway.
Why was that?
Plagued by internal civil wars, rebellions, the usual suspects for weakening empires.
Right.
However, a notable point from the source is the strategic location of their capital, Ctesiphon, on the Tigris River.
Ctesiphon, okay.
That location really contributed to its prominence and was later inherited by their successors, the Sasanians. So there's continuity there.
The source also touches on something interesting, how Iranian language and Zoroastrianism managed to survive even under later rulers, like the Seljuks, despite the big changes brought by the Islamic conquest later on.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thread. The source hints at this complex interplay of continuity and change.
Like, Iranian culture had a certain resilience.
It seems so. Even when new rulers came in, like the Seljuks, who were Turkic and initially tied to Arabic, Persian culture and language proved incredibly influential. It became the language of court and administration for many subsequent dynasties.
Really?
Yeah, the source even mentions the Seljuks adopting Zoroastrianism alongside Persian culture, which is quite an intriguing detail about cultural absorption. It highlights how multifaceted these identity shifts were.
And culturally, did the Parthians have their own distinct style in art or architecture?
The source points to examples outside Iran proper, like Nisa, showing Parthian architecture and sculpture that definitely echoes the earlier Achaemenid style. Suggests continuity.
Building on the past.
Right. But also notes a unique Parthian use of these elements. While Hellenistic Greek influence was apparently minimal in the core region of Persis under Parthian rule, the move of the capital to Ctesiphon brought an influx of Iranian elements. Public halls started resembling Achaemenid palaces again.
So, looking back, but doing their own thing. Interesting. Following the Parthians, then, we see the rise of the next great dynasty, the Sasanian Empire.
A new, really powerful dynasty emerging from Persis, that same region, in the early 3rd century CE under Ardashir I.
And the source emphasizes they really forged a new empire.
Yeah, from the remnants of the old ones. And under their 4th emperor, Khosrow I, southwestern Eurasia entered a fundamentally new phase. They really picked up that mantle of empire again.
Raised it for a second time, as the source puts it.
Exactly. And the Sasanians irrevocably set the stage for what became like a 1,000-year collision course between Iran and Rome, or later Byzantium. They established a truly formidable power.
And Ardashir, the founder, came from a religious background.
Yes, he was the chief priest of Zoroaster from a local kingdom in Fars, the Achaemenid heartland. He united Fars and the neighboring regions and established Ctesiphon as his capital in 224 CE.
Ctesiphon again, continuing its importance from the Parthians.
Right, strategic location.
How large was the Sasanian Empire at its peak? Was it comparable to the Achaemenids?
Pretty vast. By 500 AD, it controlled most of present-day Iran and adjacent provinces. At its zenith, it stretched from the Euphrates River in the west all the way to the Indus River in the east.
Wow, that's huge. So, like the Parthians, their position must have made them a major cultural crossroads again.
Definitely. Situated right on the Silk Road, interacting as a great power with Rome Byzantium on one side and China on the other. Their history is just an incredible laboratory for studying cultural interaction.
And their influence spread far.
Surprisingly far. The source notes that Sasanian influence somehow endures even today in places as far-flung as China and Japan.
China and Japan? That's incredible. Now, the Sasanian era, roughly 200 to 700 AD, overlaps with what's sometimes called the early Middle Ages in Europe, often seen as a dark age.
And that's a crucial point our source makes. While some might perceive this period as a dark age elsewhere, the Sasanians were ruling arguably the most significant Iranian and Middle Eastern civilization during this exact time.
But we don't always hear as much about them.
Right. The source notes that compared to contemporaries like Rome, India, Byzantium, China, the Sasanians remain somewhat shrouded in shadows.
Why is that? Lack of sources.
Primarily, yes. Lack of direct contemporary historical accounts, the unfortunate loss of many sources from their own time. A lot of their history remains enigmatic, known mainly through later, sometimes hostile accounts.
Did their culture incorporate elements from the past, like the Parthians did?
The source talks about their use of both archaism and innovation. They apparently adopted non-Iranian visual culture, but incorporated it into a distinctly Iranian style as a way to, legitimize their rule.
So blending tradition and new ideas.
Right, showing a dynamic interplay. This trend of looking back while moving forward reached a kind of high point under the Sasanians.
And interestingly, the source mentions Sasanian prophecies that foreshadowed major transitions coming.
Yes, prophecies that, as the source notes, the world later conceived of as Islam.
Which leads us directly into perhaps the most transformative period in Iran's entire history.
The arrival of Islam.
The Islamic conquest.
Right.
A massive event by any measure.
It really was. The Arab Empire expanded dramatically between 634 and 651 under the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab. They directly challenged both the Byzantine Empire in the west and the Sasanian Empire in the east.
And the attack on the Sasanians began when?
It kicked off around 633.
Was there a single decisive battle?
Yes, the Battle of Qadisiyah in 636, near modern Kufa in Iraq. It was a major Arab victory and had profound, far-reaching consequences, first for Persia, obviously, and then for the wider world.
And the Sasanian capital, Ctesiphon, fell shortly after.
Yes. Qadisi was besieged and surrendered after about 18 months, though it was later abandoned. New garrison cities were founded for the Arab troops, like Almadain and Kufa nearby.
And after Qadisiyah.
Following that battle, the Arab forces basically swept through the Sasanian provinces, places like Al Jazeera, Shiraz, and way out east into Khorasan.
Was there significant destruction during this conquest?
The source certainly highlights that aspect, yeah. Noting the sack of Sasanian heritage, including fortifications in major cities like Atakar and Ctesiphon itself, apparently the revenues gained from these conquests fueled further military campaigns.
The source talks about a transformation of the Arabic world during this period. What does it mean by that?
It means that from being, as the source puts it, sort of a weaker link on the world stage, it rapidly became a decisive force in human history, driven by this expansion.
But local culture wasn't entirely wiped out.
No, not entirely. The source notes some local culture enduring bazaars, farms continuing. It even hints at efforts by soldiers to strike some kind of balance in languages and military rules, suggesting maybe a degree of practical necessity for local accommodation. You couldn't just erase everything.
The initial attempts at conquest sound less organized, though, according to the source.
Yeah, the source describes some initial efforts right after the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 as a bit clumsy and hasty. Attention quickly turned to the wealth of Iran, but the major, more successful campaigns really took shape under Caliph Umar, who shifted strategies from his predecessor.
With Khuzestan in the southwest being an early focus.
Precisely. Al-Awaz in Khuzestan was an early target in 637. The source calls it a bloodless assault, interestingly. But it set the stage for later pushes into central Iran and Khorasan. Key Sasanian cities in the province of Iraq fell later: Wasit, Kufa, Baghdad.
And the conquest really spread rapidly after Qadisiyah.
Yes. After the killing of Rustam, the Persian commander at Qadisiyah, the caliphate ordered the conquest of all Persian-governed regions. Madain, Ctesiphon's neighbor, fell quickly. While fire temples in Ctesiphon are mentioned as destroyed, the army's focus then shifted.
So it wasn't all conquered immediately.
No, the final conquest of the main Sasanian territories, including key central regions like Fars, Immediate Isfahan, Kerman, places like that, wasn't actually completed until the second year of the third caliph, Uthman's rule. That's about 3 years after Khuzestan fell. Local dynasties were eventually subjugated or replaced.
This conquest triggered a massive cultural transition. The source poses this interesting question. Did it plunge a rich ancient civilization into a dark period? But then it also speaks of a simultaneous renaissance and ruination. That duality is really striking.
It is, and it seems to be a central insight from the source about this period. On one hand, yes, there was significant destruction, cities and villages ruined, initial Arab settlements being temporary military garrison.
And a spiritual vacuum.
The source suggests that, yeah, after Zoroastrianism's decline as the state religion, it argues the initial Arab arrivals brought only basic spiritual elements, pre-Islamic beliefs.
And the source seems to suggest a step backward in some areas, like knowledge.
That perspective is definitely present in the source. It states the Arabic script and lexicon introduced were often, quote, useless initially, and that knowledge and scientific progress actually went backward for a time.
But the Renaissance part is crucial too, right? It wasn't just decline.
Absolutely not. The source points out that Persian words entered the Arabic language as a sign of influence. Critically, Persian sentiments continued to influence philosophy among the elite literati. Native poets continued their traditions.
And something new emerged.
Profoundly new. It highlights the emergence of Islamic mysticism, Sufism, a movement that fostered rationality and spirituality, giving rise centuries later to towering figures like Hafez and Rumi.
Hafez and Rumi, giants of world literature.
Exactly. And a new artistic tradition emerged too. An iconic calligraphic tradition developed, where Arabic letters were formed into these incredibly imaginative shapes.
So the source's conclusion is key here.
Yes. The new Iranian cultural creations blended with Arab and other forces, leading to a simultaneous renaissance and ruination of Iranian civilization. It wasn't just replacement. It was a complex, sometimes devastating transformation that also sparked incredible new creative energy.
That duality makes it much more complex than a simple narrative of just conquest and decline. One area the source explicitly highlights as undergoing a significant negative change after the Islamic invasion is the position of women.
This is a really powerful point made in the source material, yes. It describes a profound upheaval in social strata and legal institutions impacting women.
How so?
According to the native sources referenced in our material, the position of women became, quote, terminable with the Islamic era. It's described as a serious blow to their freedom and dignity.
And new laws govern their lives, different from Sasanian times.
Yes. The source states that laws governing women were established during this time, but it argues they were heavily influenced by the existing patriarchal culture that actually predated the Quranic revelation.
So pre-existing norms continued, perhaps reinforced?
That's the argument presented. It paints a pretty grim picture, mentioning slavery and serfdom being accepted traditions, and suggesting a large number of women and girls were captured and taken to brothels during the conquest.
And their rights were neglected under the new system.
The source asserts that very little attention was paid to women's legal rights, payment for work, health, education, or labor issues. It argues that the absence of what it calls authentic Islamic rules, perhaps meaning rules distinct from cultural overlay, and the continued practice of pre-invasion traditions favoring male control significantly marginalized women.
It also mentions interpretations of scripture.
Yes, it points to certain interpretations of Quranic verses that, in this view presented by the source, considered women the cause of human downfall, leading to negative associations and restrictions.
What was the impact on their daily lives, according to this perspective?
According to the source, they became veiled, isolated, often illiterate, burdened by domestic responsibilities, and subject to monitoring by male guardians. Their social value and position are described as having declined significantly, facing contempt and oppression.
So, very little autonomy.
The source paints a picture of women having little power over their own lives, marriage becoming a fatal dependence, and even abduction being common. It's a very stark perspective presented on the social changes for women in this era.
That's a significant social shift presented in the source. Okay, moving into the medieval period, roughly the 11th to 16th centuries, we see new empires emerge, notably the Seljuks.
Yes, the Seljuks. They were a Turkic-speaking group who arrived on the scene in the early 11th century.
And they became dominant quite quickly.
They did. They conquered most of Iran and Central Asia, proclaiming themselves as warrior kings of Islam and planning for jihad.
Where did they come from originally?
They were part of the Oghuz Turks, who had migrated from Central Asia starting around the 9th century. After the fall of the Achaemenids, an earlier Persianate dynasty, a confederation of Turkic tribes, including the Seljuks, formed and gained power.
And they interacted with existing groups like the Ghaznavids to enter the Iranian plateau. Weren't the Ghaznavids also Turkic?
Exactly. The Ghaznavids were another Turkic tribe who had already carved out a territory covering parts of Afghanistan and India. The Seljuks essentially entered the Iranian plateau via Ghaznavid territory, then defeated them and rapidly gained dominance over Iran, Afghanistan, and Transoxiana by the 1030s.
How did they consolidate their power once they were dominant?
They established a formal polity, a sultanate, centered in Nishapur in northeastern Iran.
And this changed the political system.
The source sees this as a significant move. It argues it changed the prevailing system, which had perhaps overemphasized the temporal power of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. The Seljuk sultans were connected to the Caliphate, but they exercised their influence largely through appointing powerful viziers.
Viziers, right, like prime ministers.
Kind of. The most famous was Nizam al-Mulk. These viziers effectively ran the administration and bureaucracy, shaping the state.
And they reinforced a specific religious identity. They were Sunni, weren't they?
Yes, and consistent with their identity as Sunni Muslim rulers who had defeated the previous Shi'i Buwahid rulers, they founded the famous Nizamiya schools.
The madrasas.
Exactly. Focusing on Sunni canonical law and theology. This was a key move in reinforcing Sunni dominance in the region at that time.
Their influence wasn't limited to Iran either, was it? They pushed westwards, too.
No, not at all. Their victory over the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 was hugely significant.
Manzikert, yeah. Changed everything in Anatolia.
Absolutely. It established Seljuk dominance there, fundamentally shifting the political landscape across the Middle East. It led to the abolition of Byzantine provinces in the east, weakened the Ghaznavids further, and even impacted the context that later led to the Crusades.
But despite being conquerors and Turkic, they seem to have adopted and even promoted Iranian culture.
This is a key insight about the Seljuks, and something the source really emphasizes. They transformed Iran politically, but in turn, Iranian culture spread with them across Anatolia and the Levant. The ruling class heavily adopted Persian culture.
Moving away from nomadic traditions.
Yes, a slow decline of nomadic traditions and a shift towards sedentary life. The elite became immersed in Persian culture, language, music. The source emphasizes that they are perhaps best known for encouraging Persian literature, language, and culture.
So Persian became the prestige language.
It became the language of the court, administration, and literature throughout their vast empire, which stretched from India to the Mediterranean at its height.
That's a profound cultural impact for conquerors to have.
It truly is. The source highlights how this period saw Persian literature absolutely skyrocket. Renowned poets and writers emerged, composing epic poems that helped secure the language's prominence. Persian architecture also flourished, often mirroring pre-existing styles. Their cultural legacy endured long after their political power fragmented.
Which leads us inevitably to another massive, and this time profoundly destructive, event. The Mongol invasion.
Yeah. The source describes this as unequivocally one of the most destructive events in Iran's very long history.
Where did the Mongols come from relative to Iran?
They were pastoral nomads originating from the vast area northeast of Iran, sort of below the Siberian lakes, between there and the Amu Darya River. They'd already reached the fringes of Iran before the main invasion.
Was this invasion sudden or planned?
The source explicitly states it was not haphazard at all. It was planned for decades by Genghis Khan himself, part of a strategic Western Mongols campaign to avoid being hemmed in. It couldn't really be stopped by the powers of the time, like Egypt or the Abbasid Caliphate.
And the scale of destruction was immense.
The source calls the savage destruction a national catastrophe. Full stop. However, it immediately pivots to that crucial duality again.
Okay, destruction and D.
The D paved the way for a new era. It created specific new political, economic, cultural, and social realities.
So destruction and transformation, yet again.
Exactly. The source argues that for the Iranian people, the resulting Mongol Universal Empire, particularly the branch that ruled Persia, known as the Ilkhanate, this Perso-Mongol state was actually a great phenomenon.
How so? That sounds counterintuitive after catastrophe.
Because, the argument goes, it meant the focus of Iranian life returned eastward, towards Central Asia. And far from deactivating Iranian identity, the source contends, it actually flourished under Mongol rule, acquired new forms, and ultimately triumphed culturally over the Mongols themselves.
So the conquered culturally absorbed the conquerors. That old pattern again.
That is the source's view. It points to an inclination of the Mongol Khans towards pro-Iranian Persianization. While life was undoubtedly oppressive under Mongol rule, the source suggests this paradoxically fueled the continued efforts of conscious and elite Iranians to preserve and advance their own culture.
Let's look at the Ilkhanate itself, the Mongol state established in Iran. What was it like?
Well, the Mongol conquest fundamentally impacted society and the state structure. The source notes the increasing power of Persian officials within the Mongol system, which sometimes clashed with the residual Mongol contempt for the idea of Persians gaining too much independent power.
Were the Mongol rulers integrated, or were they distant overlords?
The source says the Mongol Khans were personally involved in state and military affairs. But there was also a vigilance, a suspicion, against non-Turks, particularly Persians, who might, quote, go native and try to establish their own monarchy again.
Did they have a fixed capital?
They shifted capitals, first at Miraj, then Tabriz in the northwest, and later Sultaniye, also in that region.
And did they leave an architectural mark, besides destruction?
Yes, they did. The source highlights architectural ruins and monuments, particularly public buildings in places like Tabriz and Sultaniye. It describes them as being of very high quality and having a typical Ilkhanate design, things like mosque portals noted for their grand scale, wealthy materials, and sculptural beauty. Illustrations of pilgrimage sites are also mentioned.
Okay. Moving forward from the Mongol era, new Iranian dynasties rose, reshaping the country yet again. The Safavid dynasty is perhaps the most significant in terms of shaping modern Iranian identity, isn't it?
Absolutely. The Safavids, emerging around 1499, brought about a fundamental, lasting transformation. the establishment of Shi'ism as the official state religion.
Shi'ism had been present in Iran before, right? It wasn't entirely new.
Yes, exactly. The source mentions Shi'ism being introduced much earlier by the Alawi imams and their followers associated with the Ahlul Bayt, the Prophet Muhammad's family. But it had struggled to anchor itself politically on a large scale.
So the Safavids changed that decisively.
They did. The source links the Safavid bloodline itself to this Shi'ism tradition and highlights their role in driving out Sunni rivals, like the Uzbeks from the east. Shah Abbas I, perhaps the most famous Safavid ruler, is presented as the head of Shia Islam.
And establishing Shi'ism wasn't just religious, it was also a strategic move against their powerful neighbors.
Very much so. It became the binding force of a new, distinctly Iranian state. It was used explicitly to differentiate themselves and fend off the powerful Sunni Ottoman Empire to the west and the Sunni Uzbeks to the northeast. It created a unique identity buffer.
What was the impact on the population? The source says it had been largely Sunni before this.
Yeah, that's a key point. Iranian society underwent an unprecedented religious transformation. Shi'i clergy and their followers gained immense political power, and Shi'ism became the dominant sect and eventually a nationwide custom.
Were there downsides to this presented in the source?
Yes. The source presents a critical view of some consequences. It notes fierce intolerance of religious difference by the state and the newly empowered clergy, leading to discrimination and, at times, outright persecution of Sunnis and other groups.
The clergy became very powerful, didn't they? Almost parallel to the state.
The source states the Shi'i clergies effectively ruled Iran in many ways, exercising sovereign power over the Shah in certain domains. They developed their own extensive structures, bureaucracy, intelligence networks, judiciary, patronage systems, becoming deeply integrated into socio-political life.
And what happened to other religious groups, like the Sufis?
They were marginalized, according to the source. Sunni communities and Sufi brotherhoods are described as victims of political manipulation, losing worldly authority and being controlled or suppressed by the clergy. This era is seen as consolidating an intolerant religious dichotomy of Sunni and Shi'i, with the diverse Sufi brotherhoods largely disappearing or going underground.
And the Sunni population.
The source argues the Sunni populace was, for centuries after this, excluded from many areas of learning except perhaps mathematics and largely isolated from the modern world experience developing elsewhere. It's presented as having a long-lasting impact.
That's a profound and complex legacy from the Safavid era. Moving on, the Qajar dynasty came to power later, facing a very different set of challenges. Now, the source places their rise much earlier than typically understood in the late 10th century.
Yeah, that dating in the source does seem like a significant anomaly compared to standard historical accounts, which usually place their effective founding much later, following the Safavid decline in the late 18th century.
Right. So setting aside that specific date, the context after the Safavid decline is clear. A period where central power weakened significantly.
Exactly. Iran fractured into more decentralized states, with local rulers grabbing power. After a period of struggle, Aga Muhammad Khan Qajar managed to consolidate the state again around 1794. He's the one who made Tehran his capital, which it remains today.
And this period, the Qajar era, stretching into the early 20th century, is really characterized by increasing foreign influence, isn't it?
It became a defining feature, yeah. Foreign powers actively sought to dominate Iran. Russia gained privileges in the Caspian Sea to the north, and Great Britain, after solidifying its control in India, began encroaching on Iran from the east and south.
The Great Game.
Pretty much. The major European powers started significantly interfering in Iran's internal affairs, seeking concessions, influence.
Were there attempts by the Qajars themselves to modernize and respond to this pressure, or were they just overwhelmed?
No, there were attempts. The source notes that signs of modernization started appearing around the 1860s. Nasser al-Din Shah, for instance, traveled to Europe, studied Western progress, and tried to modernize the state structure back home.
How? What did he do?
He established factories and workshops. He hired foreigners to teach at institutions like Dar al-Funun in Tehran, which was a technical school inspired by European models. There were efforts.
But these efforts weren't smooth. They caused friction.
The source says these modernization policies actually led to conflict, prompting large-scale revolts like the popular Tobacco Revolt in the 1890s.
The Tobacco Revolt, right.
Which the source sees as foundational for the emergence of political parties later on. The idea of a parliamentary system also started to gain traction during this time.
Where did that idea come from? Was it internal or external?
According to the source, the desire for a parliament, maybe similar to the Ottoman model next door, emerged with the influx of Western culture, increased literacy rates, and crucially, the rise of vernacular newspapers in cities like Tabriz and Tehran.
Newspapers spreading new ideas.
Exactly. These newspapers, read even by peasants and laborers according to the source, spread awareness of rights and constitutional ideas, kind of electrifying society.
And this political agitation culminated in the Constitutional Revolution in the early 20th century. The source mentions protests around 1905 leading up to it, though its references to the 13th and 14th centuries in this context still seem like dating inconsistencies.
Yeah, setting aside those specific date references again, the early 20th century is clearly presented as the period of intense political agitation stemming from all these pressures and new ideas. It led directly to the push for a constitutional monarchy and a parliament, the Majlis.
And the revolution was seen as a path to modernity, but also as a way to protect national independence from those foreign powers.
Yeah, absolutely. The source sees constitutionalism as a key symbol of modernity. It was intended to elevate Iran's status internationally and, crucially, protect it from the growing threat of colonization, securing national independence based on international recognition and treaties.
So parliament and rule of law were seen as essential.
They were viewed as preconditions for progress, for modern education, for a modern polity that could stand up for itself.
The struggle involved violence, though.
The source notes that the revolutionary struggle itself was seen by participants as requiring and justifying violence to achieve legitimacy. However, it makes a pointed observation that negative practices, corruption, treason, embezzlement, even political killings continued despite the revolutionary ideals, highlighting a disconnect between aspirations and the often brutal reality of the power struggles.
Were different groups united in their goals for the revolution, or were there competing visions?
Not fully united, no. The source describes different factions pulling in different directions. The hierarchy, the powerful clerics, were hesitant to contradict established doctrines. Monarchists were gambling on military suppression to regain full control. And the intelligentsia, the modernizers who were often the driving force initially, became frustrated with the unfulfilled promises or even fled.
And the average person?
Meanwhile, the source suggests the majority of the population simply aspired to blend traditional ways of life with the benefits of modernity. So lots of conflicting currents.
And throughout this, foreign influence remained a constant shadow, right? Especially concerning oil.
It became deeply entrenched, yeah. Particularly centered on oil interests. From the mid-19th century onwards, Western nations prioritized access to Iran's oil. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, APOC, received its major concession in 1901, later reaffirmed in 1933.
And this vast oil wealth, did it actually translate into broad national development, or did it mostly benefit foreigners and the elite?
The source argues pretty strongly for the latter. While oil revenues certainly filled the treasury in Tehran, it contends that little else resulted for the country's broader development. Modernizing authorities, it argues, failed to effectively address economic development and national sovereignty.
Why not?
Partly because legal structures put in place by Western powers remained skewed, hindering independent development, while development serving foreign interests like extracting oil thrived.
This must have fueled a lot of resentment over time.
It absolutely did. A growing educated elite emerged, often with broadened horizons from education pursued abroad, and they demanded reforms. But this very pursuit of modernism, which was intended to bring enlightenment, was seen by some, as the source notes, as being meddled by foreign menace, leading to this sense of inescapable dependence.
The source uses strong terms here, doesn't it? Like Westoxication.
It does. That term, garbzdagi, in Persian, used by some intellectuals at the time, described the perceived negative cultural and psychological effects of Western penetration and influence. It contributed to a sense of alienation. The source suggests that a resurgence of traditionalism emerged partly as a reaction against this pervasive Western impact.
This simmering dissatisfaction, particularly over oil, eventually led to the nationalization crisis.
Yes, the nationalization of the oil industry, declared in March 1951. This was led by the hugely popular nationalist Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. It sparked strikes and massive political mobilization.
But the British company didn't just accept it.
No, APOs, by then Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC, initially refused to honor the agreement to leave. The source notes that by 1952, Mossadegh's supporters felt they needed to use Western tactics themselves, meaning covert methods, to counter the foreign powers and try to unseat the foreign threat.
Which brings us directly to the 1953 coup, a really pivotal, controversial event.
Absolutely pivotal. The source states a coup planned by the CIA with British MI6 cooperation was launched on the night of August 19, 1953. It does note, interestingly, that the coup did not proceed according to plans initially, suggesting some chaos or near failure in its execution before it ultimately succeeded.
Okay, let's step back slightly just to place this. Before the coup, following an earlier coup in 1921, Reza Khan had come to power, establishing the Pahlavi dynasty.
Yes, that's right. After the 1921 coup, Reza Khan consolidated power and was proclaimed monarch as Reza Shah Pahlavi in 1925. He preferred the title Shah over Sultan.
And his goal was national revival.
He aimed to revive national pride, suppressed internal opposition quite ruthlessly. The source suggests he took a more independent stance after consolidating power around 1924, moving away from the overt British and Soviet influence that had marked the Qajar era.
He embarked on a significant program of modernization, didn't he? Often quite forceful.
He did, yes, often involving a deliberate effort to Persianize the country, which included restricting other languages like Turkish and Kurdish, and enforcing specific Western-style dress codes.
Controversial.
Very. He also suppressed the powerful Shiite clerical establishment, which had strong ties to the previous Safavid and Qajar eras. The Pahlavis tried to present themselves as linked to ancient, pre-Islamic Iranian authority, while also aligning firmly with the West.
This mix of nationalism, suppression, and Western ties sounds like a complex balancing act, or maybe not so balanced.
It was definitely complex and maybe inherently unstable. The source argues their reforms blended nationalistic elements with what it calls undesired observances and rituals from the clergy's perspective. This fueled anti-Pahlavi movements among the clergy, often operating from exile in places like Najaf in Iraq.
So opposition was brewing early on.
While open opposition was difficult due to suppression, the source notes that underground groups, both right-wing monarchists who felt Reza Shah wasn't legitimate, nationalists with different ideas, and left-wing socialists, communists, grew stronger over time.
Reza Shah's modernization efforts, though, they sound quite ambitious on paper.
Oh, tremendous efforts were made, infrastructure-wise especially. The source lists some impressive achievements, building something like 8,000 kilometers of railway, expanding telegraph and telephone networks, establishing compulsory education with hundreds of new schools and a modern curriculum, building Iran's first paved roads.
That's major foundational stuff.
Definitely. A central bank was created, currency managed, state monopolies established on things like sugar and tobacco, customs houses organized.
It sounds like state building 101.
In many ways, yes. And the source calls these impressive achievements. However, it immediately adds the caveat that they were far from sufficient to overcome the country's deep-seated backwardness.
And the approach was heavy-handed.
According to the source, the approach involved an intensification of totalitarian measures, led by military leaders, bureaucrats, and modernist intellectuals. Huge sums were spent on ambitious plans for infrastructure, industry, irrigation, bringing in foreign advisors.
But the results didn't always match the plans.
The source states that many of these massive plans seldom bore the promised results. It attributes this partly to ill-prepared and often corrupt bureaucrats who squandered money through bribery, partly due to a lack of proper organization, feasibility studies, and understanding of local conditions.
Despite these issues, the foundations were laid.
Yes. The source acknowledges that under the two Pahlavi Shahs, Reza Shah and his son Mohammad Reza Shah, the foundations of modern infrastructure were laid, often with significant British and American help. It notes Iran gained a seat in the League of Nations in 1930, which the source links to the perceived success of the modernization plan at the time.
The Pahlavi era also saw a very pronounced rise in Iranian nationalism, or at least a specific version of it.
Yes, this new Iranian awareness, focused on unifying the Persian people under a single national identity, had roots in the late 19th century but really intensified under the Pahlavis. Many Iranians developed a stronger sense of national identity and shared heritage around the time of the Qajar decline and the rise of Reza Shah.
And this nationalism was presented as an alternative.
An alternative to the West, yeah, which was seen paradoxically as both a model of material advancement and a source of Iran's perceived backwardness due to foreign interference.
How inclusive was this Iranianness?
The source notes, it was often a singular identity that consistently overlooked differences among the Persian, Turkish, and Arab peoples in Iran. It was promoted by the political elite, who adopted modern structures like parliament, where debates became key national forums. Avant-garde artists and poets also challenged power, sometimes using the same nationalist language.
And the monarchy actively tried to construct this national identity.
Very actively and consciously, by staging large-scale nationalist events, like Reza Shah's 1925 coronation, which was designed as a spectacle explicitly linking the new dynasty to ancient pre-Islamic Iranian authority. Institutions like schools and the press were also crucial tools used to unify the public around Iran as a central concept and object of knowledge.
Did it work? Did it create a unified nation?
The source argues this top-down construction of the nation was ultimately a failure. Why? Because the Western-oriented elite promoting it lacked broad public following, often having very different values and identities from the majority of the population. Modern ideas, despite the efforts, also produced new divisions, sometimes at odds with the very European-American models they were trying to emulate.
Okay, let's loop back now to the 1953 coup and its immediate aftermath, as the source argues it was such a direct precursor to the Islamic Revolution later.
Right, so the events of August 19, 1953 saw Prime Minister Mossadegh detained, the parliament dissolved, and General Fazlullah Zahedi, a military figure, installed as the new prime minister.
And the source highlights the context. Mossadegh had come to power partly because American influence wasn't initially enough to stop the popular demand for oil nationalization.
Exactly. It frames the coup as a direct response to that successful nationalization.
The source really emphasizes the foreign role in 1953. It doesn't mince words.
Not at all. It paints a clear picture of significant foreign involvement, describing the coup as planned by the CIA with British cooperation. It explicitly states that the rationale often given fear of Soviet influence in Iran was overplayed, primarily to secure British help, as Britain was desperate to regain control of the oil.
So oil was the main driver from this perspective.
That's the strong implication. The source confirms the British were involved in laying the groundwork for the CIA-led operation to replace Mossadegh with a royalist government. And the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, subsequently embraced the U.S. as his main benefactors.
What was the public perception of this coup within Iran, according to the source?
The source suggests very few Iranians truly accepted the official narrative that it was an internal uprising against a potentially communist-leaning leader. It says most believe the details of Mossadegh's overthrow, but not the whole story presented by the new regime and its backers.
It connects the street demonstrations used against Mossadegh in late 1952, early 1953 to underlying public grievances.
Yes, suggesting these grievances were perhaps exploited or manipulated. It uses strong language, describing Mossadegh being put on a retractable cart via demonstrations, implying political manipulation leading to his downfall.
Okay, so after the coup, Mohammad Reza Shah's son, consolidated his power.
Yes. He had inherited the throne back in 1941 when his father was forced to abdicate by the Allies during WWII. Initially, he ruled more constitutionally. But after 1953, he quickly moved to increase his personal power and control, exercising significant repression for years.
And the source argues the coup actually damaged the monarchy's legitimacy long-term.
It contends that post-1953, the monarch's administrative authority was fundamentally discredited in the eyes of many Iranians. In contrast, the clergy, despite the Pahlavis' earlier efforts to suppress them, gradually became, in the source's words, all-powerful behind the scenes, developing their own political agendas and reconciling them with Shia principles.
So the Shah became more reliant on external powers.
Yes. The source argues the Shah relied heavily on foreign powers, particularly the U.S., and seemed to know no limits in his increasingly autocratic rule.
He launched a major reform program, the White Revolution, in the 1960s. What was that about?
It was presented as an ambitious modernization and reform program, land reform, literacy campaigns, women's suffrage, though controversial. It had massive social implications.
But it wasn't just about progress.
Well, the source notes it also involved increased censorship, expansion of bureaucratic controls, state monitoring through the notorious Savak secret police, and massive military funding. And a particularly controversial and dangerous aspect highlighted by the source was the rapid expansion of education and literacy.
Dangerous? How could education be dangerous to the regime?
According to the source's perspective, this expansion unintentionally generated a new, larger educated elite. These people, along with existing merchant and religious elites who also felt alienated, became a crippling threat to the regime.
Because they could see the regime's flaws more clearly.
That's the idea presented. The source uses the striking phrase, incapacitated by education, suggesting that spreading knowledge, even if intended to modernize, ultimately equipped people to recognize and challenge the regime's corruption, repression, and dependence on foreign powers. It argues the planned educational expansion backfired due to poor implementation, mismanagement, and unanticipated consequences like rising expectations.
So the Shah's own reforms inadvertently created a more potent opposition.
Precisely. The source argues that by the early 1970s, an active, organized, and highly secretive religious opposition network had emerged. This network effectively combined Ayatollah Khomeini's powerful religious ideas with revived nationalist messages, mobilizing a population where, according to the source, the basic reliability of life had declined and people increasingly yearned for pre-modern traditional virtues as an alternative.
And Khomeini himself gained significant popular support. He became the figurehead.
The source says he did, yeah, gaining immense popularity by expressing both nationalist concerns and emphasizing core Shia principles of justice and resistance to tyranny. He was seen by many as a contemporary Cyrus-like figure, promising liberation.
And the source explicitly links the 1953 coup directly to the conditions that led to the 1979 revolution.
It draws a very direct line. It argues the U.S. rejection of the oil nationalization directly led to the planning and execution of the coup. The repression that followed the coup forced key dissenters like Khomeini into exile, which paradoxically radicalized them and gave them more freedom to organize.
And the coup weakened other opposition groups.
Yes, it argues the coup disabled many other secular and leftist dissident movements, leaving the religious opposition with its deep roots in society as the main organized force capable of challenging the Shah.
So the Shah, emboldened after 1953, made missteps.
The source suggests that, emboldened by U.S. backing after the coup, the Shah took measures that further alienated the clergy, like trying to reduce their status, contributing significantly to their radicalization. Initial protests against his rule were often religious in form, although the underlying grievances were deeply political and economic.
And Khomeini skillfully used anti-Western sentiment.
Yes, the source notes Khomeini's movement drew heavily on both international Islamic solidarity and potent opposition to U.S. cultural and political hegemony to attack the Shah. It concludes this point by arguing that Western analysts at the time largely failed to appreciate the deeply Islamic nature of the opposition movement and completely misread its potential.
Which culminated, of course, in the Islamic Revolution in 1979.
A truly seismic event that reshaped Iran and the entire region. The Shah was forced to flee on January 16, 1979, amid massive widespread protests involving a very diverse range of groups, religious, nationalist, leftists, all demanding his removal. This created a sudden power vacuum.
And into this vacuum, the source describes conservative clerics maneuvering skillfully to seize control.
Yes. Taking advantage of their deep, long-standing legitimacy in Iranian society. The source says conservative clerics engaged in subtle yet trenchant maneuverings to gain power from the disparate groups that had momentarily united against the Shah.
How did they do that?
Apparently, they softened their public opposition to the departing Shah regime slightly. And according to the source, Khomeini used soothing proclamations toward the united opposition groups, promising amnesty, clemency, cooperation.
But these promises were hollow.
The source uses very strong language here. It says these promises ultimately became like gulps of poisonous vapors, which served to exterminate the struggles and dreams of their erstwhile allies, the leftists, the nationalists, the liberals. It portrays a deliberate Machiavellian design by the revolutionary triumvirate around Khomeini to consolidate state control and establish the specific Islamic regime he envisioned, effectively staging a counter-revolution against a broader united opposition.
A powerful and quite somber description of the revolution's immediate outcome as presented in the source. Okay, moving into the post-revolution era, the Iran-Iraq War is an unavoidable major event.
A truly devastating conflict that lasted 8 long years, from 1980 to 1988. The source states it was incited by Iraqi President Saddam Hussein.
What were his motives?
Driven by his own territorial ambitions, inspired partly by the perceived post-revolution chaos and weakness in Iran, aiming for Arab dominance in the Persian Gulf, and perhaps wanting to protect Arab populations from the influence of Communism and prevent refugee flows.
He launched a full-scale invasion.
On September 2010, 1980, Iraq invaded with a large military force. Iran responded fiercely, announcing it as the cruelest slaughter. Despite UN ceasefire calls early on, Khomeini famously refused to stop fighting.
He wanted total victory.
He demanded total victory, even saying the war might last 20 years. This imposed immense hardship on the Iranian people, but also intensified the war effort, fueled by revolutionary fervor initially.
Iran did manage to recover territory lost early on, didn't it?
Yes. By the end of 1982, much of the Iranian land lost in the initial Iraqi invasion was recovered. However, the war then ground on for many more years, with incredibly costly and largely unsuccessful Iranian offensives into Iraqi territory. Khomeini's broader ambitions were effectively scuttled by 1986.
It became a brutal war of attrition.
Absolutely, resulting in immense destruction and loss of life on both sides. Eventually, the source notes, the Iranian people became exhausted and clamored for peace.
What was the impact on society, according to the source, beyond the obvious destruction?
The source notes a significant shift in public sentiment over the long war. The initial revolutionary hope and belief in divine punishment for the aggressor gave way to despair and a weary acceptance of sacrifice. While there was rampant nationalism promoted in the media around 1986, by the war's end, the source describes unsolicited letters and articles expressing shock, amazement, shame, and criticism of sycophants. Lamentation and sorrow replaced the nationalistic fervor. Even conservative poets lamented the martyrs, while pundits fell quiet.
A profound national trauma. And the war must have had a massive economic impact, compounding the challenges Iran already faced post-revolution.
Oh, absolutely. Iran's economy had actually performed reasonably well before 1978, but the post-revolution period, heavily impacted by the war, was extremely difficult. The source notes a structural shift away from non-oil industrial diversification towards heavy reliance on crude oil exports, alongside agriculture and services.
So, less varied exports, more vulnerable.
Exactly. Non-oil industrial exports declined sharply, replaced by crude oil, which makes the economy highly vulnerable to volatile global commodity price shocks.
Did oil revenue help offset the war costs or fund development?
High oil revenues did help finance a wide range of social and economic programs, and certainly the war effort. However, the source argues that inefficient investment policies led to significant misallocation of these resources. Well, public investment in agriculture increased significantly, partly with the aim of creating jobs, since it's labor-intensive. But these efforts were hampered by misallocation, driven by competing priorities like nation-building projects, and of course the overwhelming demands of the war itself.
The war was a major external shock to the economy then.
The source calls it exactly that. A major external shock that retarded growth significantly more than similar shocks impacted other nations, like the G7 countries after oil price shocks. It contrasts Iran's pre-war economic potential with the war-torn reality of hyperinflation and chaotic domestic markets.
And trade suffered too.
Severely. External trade was impacted by the general turbulence, lack of reliable information, sanctions, and the war itself. The post-war scenario described includes neutralization of the economy due to shortages, electricity, transport, fuel rationing, import restrictions, soaring prices, and high inflation, all impacting non-oil trade especially.
Okay, turning towards Iran in the 21st century, what does the source identify as the key challenges facing the Islamic Republic today?
The source highlights popular activism and insurgency as a really potent challenge. While external threats definitely exist, the U.S. presence in post-invasion Iraq, the Arab Spring fallout, regional rivalries, militant groups, the source suggests the state can often manage these or even use them sometimes to bolster its own legitimacy by emphasizing the need for self-defense.
So the more significant challenges are internal, that's the argument.
According to the source, yes. The deeper vulnerabilities are seen as potentially existential. It points to the country's susceptibility to internal accidents, things arising from government recklessness, data issues, rivalries within the establishment, ambitious defense programs going wrong, poor crisis sensitivity, all leading to rising systemic risk.
But the most critical vulnerability is popular discontent.
That's presented as the most noteworthy challenge. Widespread popular discontent stemming from the state's perceived failure to fix long-standing grievances related to the economy, social freedoms, political participation.
And this discontent is leading to a fundamental loss of legitimacy.
Yes. The source sees trends like mass detachment from the idea of rights and participatory politics, and a growing subversion of the state's official narrative, coalescing into a powerful bottom-up challenge to the very foundations of the Islamic Republic.
How is this dissent being met by the establishment?
The source describes early encounters between popular dissent and an increasingly illiberal establishment responding with disproportionate violence. It predicts, or rather presages, a protracted conflict that has already escaped easy state control, with state institutions themselves hampered by what it calls dismantled legitimacy.
And the nature of activism itself is changing, becoming more radical.
The source notes a worrying shift towards more radical forms of activism, mentioning things like industrial sabotage, acts of vengeance, and increasingly open calls for outright regime change. This indicates, it argues, a fundamental shift in public sentiment among dissenters.
And the establishment's response.
The source concludes this section by stating the establishment seems groomed for conflict, continues to rely heavily on revolutionary Islamism for its identity, won't forego its claim to Islamic legitimacy, and seems unlikely to genuinely redress grievances through state-led democratization or social justice reforms. A fairly bleak outlook presented there.
Another major aspect of modern Iran, impossible to ignore, is its nuclear program and the international relations surrounding it.
Absolutely central to its foreign policy and image. Interestingly, the history of Iran's nuclear program actually began under the Shah.
Oh, really? Before the revolution?
Yes, he was preparing to operate reactors. After the 1979 revolution, the new government initially consulted the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, about peaceful uses. However, international cooperation changed dramatically soon after.
How did it change? Did Western countries pull out?
Completely. Western countries, which had actually assisted Iran with research reactors and fuel cycle facilities since the mid-1960s under the Shah, curtailed all cooperation after he fell. Post-1979, technology denial became explicit policy and accelerated. Iran lost its foreign partners, its access to scientific databases, and existing infrastructure support. Agreements, like one with France for a reactor, were unilaterally aborted.
So Iran felt isolated and pushed towards developing its own capabilities. What reasons does the source provide for Iran's pursuit of the program since then?
The source links it partly to historical incidents. Iran's long history of being impacted by foreign powers, its concerns about the geopolitical context, its past experiences as a victim of foreign attacks, like the Iran-Iraq War, where Iraq used chemical weapons. It frames the pursuit as following a legal, political, and rational pathway from Iran's perspective.
And the Islamic Revolution itself changed the strategic thinking behind it.
Fundamentally. Following the revolution, the source says, Iran felt a strong need to stand on its own principles. Things like justice, independence, removing foreign influence, avoiding domination or hegemony. Pursuing the nuclear program became seen as a way to achieve relative security in a perceived hostile international environment and project power based on these new revolutionary principles.
This contrasts sharply with the Shah's era then.
As the source notes, yes. During the Shah's time, Iran was firmly Western-oriented. Its foreign policy focused more on passive defense within that alliance, and the need for indigenous nuclear energy wasn't felt in the same urgent way. Western countries actively assisted and encouraged Iran's nuclear efforts until that dependent regime was ended by the revolution. Then the shutters came down.
Finally, let's try to weave in some of the broader cultural threads and the idea of enduring identity. Perhaps revisiting the theme of women's rights, which we touched on in the context of the Islamic conquest, but how did things evolve later, particularly in the 20th century?
That's a good way to round things out. The source does bring back the topic of women's status, specifically highlighting changes under the Pahlavi dynasty, beginning with Reza Shah after 1925.
His modernization efforts explicitly included women.
Yes, his modernization and development efforts, which explicitly used the West as a model, included widespread reforms in education, law, the economy, etc. Women's emancipation was a stated part of this top-down plan.
And the name change to Iran in 1935, was that related?
The source views this name change, from the more historical Persia, as symbolizing this new international and local identity. A strong desire to be recognized as a modern, civilized state, joining the family of nations. It was a fashionable move for nations seeking progress and recognition at the time.
The Pahlavis seemed to consciously promote women's visibility in public life then.
They definitely planned to institutionalize it. The source notes active encouragement for girls to attend schools and universities. By 1938, women were apparently a significant percentage, maybe 70% in Tehran, of students in higher education, studying alongside men in various fields. Women's departments were established in ministries and universities.
How did this compare to other countries in the region?
The source contrasts this with other states that restricted women's visibility, often disapproving of westernization.
And these newly educated women began to organize and push for more rights.
Yes, exactly. These women sought organizations to make their presence felt and, crucially, demand legal amendments, particularly regarding family law and political rights. Women had historically lacked voting rights in Iran.
Was there movement on suffrage?
The source mentions a bill proposed back in 1948 for women's suffrage. The government seemed supportive but avoided making it a major national issue. A campaign for the bill later gained momentum, partly in response to political events and with some international support or advice mentioned.
But was there resistance to this women's rights activism even under the modernizing Pahlavis?
Yes. The source includes a stark detail that highlights the limits. In 1967, Safavid, the Shah's secret police, actually raided women's rights offices and arrested prominent activists. They were interrogated in 1968 and released, but only with warnings not to continue their activism.
So even the Pahlavi modernization had its very real limits and involved repression.
It certainly highlights the contradictions within those top-down modernization attempts, despite the stated goals of emancipation. Progress wasn't always linear or freely given.
This deep dive journey has been absolutely incredible. We've covered millennia of history, haven't we?
We really have.
From the ancient Elamites and the mighty Achaemenids through the rise and fall of empires like the Parthians and Sasanians.
The massive cultural and religious transformations brought by Islam, and then the Safavids establishing Shi'ism as central to identity.
To periods of intense foreign influence and internal struggle, those repeated attempts at modernization under the Qajars and Pahlavis.
Leading up to the Islamic Revolution, a devastating war, and the really complex challenges Iran faces in the 21st century.
It really underscores the vastness and complexity, just as the source material noted at the beginning. It's a history where studies are often fragmentary, piecing things together.
And where a complete picture really requires weaving together so many threads, including, hopefully, more indigenous perspectives as they become available.
And our aim here was really to provide that shortcut, wasn't it? Pulling out the key insights, the dramatic turns, the recurring patterns from this immense narrative for you, the listener.
And what really stands out, I think, are those persistent themes we kept seeing. Those cycles of powerful empires rising and falling, the constant pressure and influence, often interference from foreign powers.
That tension between deeply rooted traditions and the powerful forces of modernity.
Exactly. And the recurring emergence of internal dissent, popular movements demanding change, pushing back against authority.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? About how those ancient echoes, those deep historical patterns and traumas continue to resonate in the challenges and the movements we see happening in Iran today.
Absolutely. How do these deep historical forces continue to shape Iran's path forward? What aspect of this long, intricate, sometimes tragic, often brilliant story makes you most curious to explore further?